What was the inspiration for this show?
Um, After my father died, and it's in the show, it's Christmas Day 1992, I started to writing to process his death. I was writing a lot about him and our family and about his life and death. But I also started writing about Jewish subjects, the Jewish, growing up Jewish and being Jewish in the United States of America here, and thinking about that. And I had the show, worked on the show for a while, and I got sidetracked doing other things, and was writing books for one thing. But then I started working with the director in about 2014 on the script, and it turned out we had not one show but two. And there was this show. The first show we did was called Black Tie's Son's Journey Through the Death and Life of His Father, and that's really more a family memoir. This one is about my family, but it's really about being Jewish in America today, and during my upbringing, and not only about being Jewish, but about how, I like to say, it's about how modern humans live with ancient traditions. And I think there's so much to think about and talk about on that subject. It lends itself to a drama and lends itself to comedy. So I guess that's where it came from. I'm not sure exactly how I wound up with this Jewish show, this Jewish show. I'm not a particularly observant Jew. I don't attend the synagogue very often. I mean, I go on holidays, but I guess there's something inside that's important to me, and that's where it came from.
So you would sort of classify this as a Jewish work, meaning you could.
I guess it is. I mean, I like to think it has appeal beyond our tribe, but the subject is mostly Jews, so really can't get around that.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the intended audience, but is there such a thing here?
Well, I hope it's for people who are, for Jews, but for people who are open-minded, Jews and other faiths. I mean, people who are, frankly, who are rigid in their beliefs, one way or the other, probably might not appreciate the show, because it does, I don't know, cross some lines. Both for Christians and for Jews, there are things that some people might find objectionable, but I hope that they'll approach it with an open mind and look at it as, say, well, this is one person's worldview, and let's listen to what this guy has to say, and I hope they find it interesting.
Yeah, I mean, one would think that if you're going to a play, that you would be open, meaning it's art. It's not a theology, it's not an argument necessarily on theology and sort of facts, right? It's art in a way that art should be questioning, and passing line seems pretty natural.
Yeah, I hope so. There are things here, and it's from the heart, and hopefully people will be able to see that and take it that way, and understand it that way, whether or not each point in the play is something that they can agree with or cheer on.
Yeah. Sure. This would not be the first time then that you're performing this, or is it
the first time
that you're performing this?
No, I've been performing it for a while. The last couple of years I've done it mostly by Zoom, of course. I really thought we were just going to have to shut it down when the pandemic started, but I was offered a chance to do a performance on Zoom. It worked pretty well, so I did a whole bunch of them. But I just decided it was time to get it into a theater and get it mounted on a stage and see what we had with it. So that's why we're producing it in a really nice space in a theater for an extended run.
Right. I guess for people who might be interested, this is a more technical question, what is the process of getting something put back into a theater?
Well, you have to find a theater, you have to rent a theater, there's all sorts of, unfortunately I have a producer named Sam Hoda-Drain, who's a great young fellow, and he's I'm showing my age by calling him a young fellow, I guess. Young guy, and anyway, he's taking care of all the details. And there are the details, you need a lighting designer, you need a stage manager, you need rehearsal space, you need insurance, this kind of insurance, you need that kind of insurance, you need all sorts of little things, you need gaffer's tape and gels for the lighting, you have to make sure the lighting is right, all this stuff that you need. So that it's complicated. There are a lot of steps that go into putting something into a theater in New York City. So it's complicated, and couldn't have done it myself, certainly.
And why the format of theater? Meaning, you mentioned you're writing books. So what about this topic sort of lent itself to stage play?
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought. I've always been. I mean, I originally came to New York to be a performer, and I did stand-up comedy for 10 years. I toured the country. I was all over the place. So I guess I always thought of this as a performance piece more than a written work. It's a chance to, I think it's interesting. It can be a written work, and I've talked about it with my director publishing it, but it's really more the performance is a big part of, I think, getting the message across.
And why one man versus maybe more of a story where somebody's playing your father, somebody's playing more parts?
Well, I did stand-up comedy, and this is kind of, I guess it grew out of that. It just grew out of being a stand-up, being, the man, just, the guy standing in front of the microphone and talking. So this is just, it's sort of, an evening with me talking to people, telling them my worldview, I guess.
And then what's like that process like of writing such a show? Is it you put it all down on paper, you sort of have people watch you while you're performing, or how does that go?
Well, I wrote a lot of it. I mean, as I said, I wrote a lot of it some years ago. I've written parts of it more recently. I've done, I have a great terrific director, by the way, Brian Lane Green, a Tony nominee, and he's just marvelous. And he and I worked on this over a number of years, and we would work on it and try to, take the writing and then shape it and mold it. And he said his job was to theatricalize it, to make it into a show. And it involved a lot of cutting. We had to, I think it's famous, Michelangelo saw the block of marble and he said, "There's the David in there." He just had to cut out the excess. So we had a lot, of cutting to do, and a lot of shaping. And a lot of molding. So most of it is, there are a few parts of this show that are, one part in particular that's pretty much almost word for word what came out of my fingers on the keyboard originally, but most of it has been massaged and worked on and edited and shaped over the time we've been, preparing the show.
Sure. My wife and I came, and we enjoyed ourselves thoroughly. One thing we were just so impressed by was you memorized like a 2-hour show, and it's just you. So how do you memorize so much? It seems just a lot.
When were you there?
Thursday night.
Oh, you were there Thursday. Thursday was a good, it was a good show. We had a good crowd on Thursday. Comedy, is so dependent on the audience, so it helps to have a good big audience and an audience of laughers. It's a lot to memorize. It's sort of like a 50 or 60 page book. If you write books, a page is around 330 words. This is like 16,000 words. So it took a long time to memorize it, and I still try to run the show in my head just quickly every day before. Even though I've done it the night before, I still try to do it again, just because there's so many words. I want to just make sure it comes out automatically and properly. Because my writing, I'm sort of I have this, I'm looking at it right now, a sign above my desk, and I've had it up there for years. It's a quote from Mark Twain: "The difference between the almost right word and the right word is really a huge matter. It's the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning." So every word sort of counts, and so I try to be careful with every word. So it is a chore to make sure I get it as close to word perfect every night.
That's interesting, because you're talking about comedy. I feel like in some ways comedy is sort of an ad lib. You're up on stage and something's working, you sort of go more into it, or you sort of take away from things that perhaps are not working so much with the crowd. But with this play, I guess maybe less freedom in terms of being able to manipulate.
Well, different comics work differently. Some comics it's all very scripted, and others it's more free flowing. But this play, it's there's some, if you recall, toward early on, there's some leeway for improvising, but not much. It's mostly just pretty much a set script, and especially now, what with there are lighting cues and there's sound and video cues, so I kind of have to adhere to the script to make sure all of that is on track, not to confuse the person running the lighting, running the board, running the
Sure.
stage manager running the show.
Yeah, I mean, part of you can tell me. Obviously, I don't want to get into too much of the details. I want people to go see the show, so you'll have to maybe guide us through. But do you have sort of a purpose for the show? Like, do you want it to make an argument to change sort of things, or is it more of just an expression, or how do you sort of see?
Well, that's a
this?
good question. I hope people will leave thinking about some of the big questions in new ways, thinking about God, about the nature of good and evil, how we live with our traditions in this modern age, how we are, we process our traditions, whether they're Jewish or not, in the modern age, how we live with, especially Jews, but not only Jews, how we live with the big reality of the Shoah, the Holocaust in our lives, how this thing happened to us, how do we go on being Jews? I think that's an important question. There's no good answer to that question, but I try to present a couple of answers in the show, just possible answers that could be that you could point toward or draw from, not necessarily to embrace any one answer. But I hope people will go away thinking about these things in new ways. And I also hope some people will think about, what does it mean to be Jewish here in the 21st century in the United States of America? What is that all about? How do we do that? And why do we continue being Jews? I mean, what's the point of it? We're such a tiny people. We're 0.2% of the world's population, yet we've had this outsized influence on the world's culture and history. Not the influence that a lot of people think we have, of course, but still, some things are undeniable. We've had a large influence way beyond our numbers. What's the point of it? Why do we keep on being Jews? That's something I hope people will think about too.
I mean, yeah, it's a very, I think perhaps with like our work also, it's a lot of it has to do with the idea of defining what a Jew is. I think that's maybe one of your opening questions, is the idea of what is a Jew? How do we define that? And
right.
And what's the purpose in the sense of, like, is it to uphold tradition, to pass down tradition? Is it to create new tradition? Like, how does that all balance itself? And I think oftentimes we look for that in the artwork rather than perhaps in like a halachic context, or trying to understand Jewish laws. And interesting, but there's not really that space necessarily to explore those questions and push those boundaries.
One thing I talk about in the show, you may recall, is that every year at Passover we say, not only we say, when we say literally, we say not only were our ancestors slaves in Egypt, we say we ourselves were slaves in Egypt too. We say the Almighty did this not just for them, they did this for me, they did this for us, they did this for those of us here in the present day. And I think there's just such an important lesson to take from that teaching, that we were all slaves in Egypt. We were and Jews have done phenomenally well in this country. We're prosperous, we're successful, we're represented well beyond our numbers in academia and the professions. As I say in the show, there are 9 Jews in the United States Senate. We're 2% of the U.S. population. We have 9 Jews in the United Senate. Until recently, we had a third of the Supreme Court. But it's important to remember where we came from, how we got here, how our lives, how our presence in this country developed, where it started, where we came from, and to apply that lesson to other people who do not share our religion, who pray to a different God, who look different from us, who have different color skin, speak different languages. It's important to apply those lessons, to remember that we were slaves in Egypt, and we were all, not just Jews, we were all slaves in Egypt. We all have been oppressed and exploited, and we've all been poor and needy and neglected, and we've all needed a helping hand. So I guess I hope that Jews in America keep that in mind. And the truth is that Jews in America do. They politically they believe in a certain way, and it's contrary to sort of the economic self-interest argument. Jews vote Democratic, even though we're a prosperous group, and that's contrary to the larger demographic trends. So I hope that so there's a lesson there, and the lesson is that we all have to remember where we came from, and not forget, as I say in this show, we Jews know what a majority can do to a minority, and I think that influences our behavior and our way of thinking. And I just that's another thing in the show I hope people will come away with, remembering that point.
Yeah, it is a very interesting lesson about, and sort of putting a modern, the idea of epigenetics and how trauma is sort of relived and passed on. And it comes into play. You do tackle also the idea of the Shoah and how that sort of affects us still today, and this idea of slavery or suffering and how that's still present. It's always interesting to me how we do sort of focus on that as a people. I always, think about how do we take that and sort of, I don't know how to maneuver it in a positive way, or is it positive in and of itself? Like, how do we sort of think of that experience?
Yeah, the Shoah. Well, we could look at it. We could just say, take the lesson that no one in the world is going to defend the Jews. No one's going to save us, and I think that's true. Ultimately, we can't really trust other people. This country, it's interesting, in this country, we've looked at it as really a second land of milk and honey, and it has been. We've prospered and flourished here, unlike anywhere else really in world history, I guess, until the state of Israel. But here, my grandparents came here during the Great Wave, during the first decade of the 20th century. We're fortunate that they were here during the 1930s and 40s and not there. It was so important for them to come to a place where they could flourish and be free to be Jews and not have to worry about that pounding on the door in the middle of the night from the czarist hordes or from the SS. And we've been able to build up institutions and live freely and be integrated into society and do all these other things, be mostly accepted, even though I think the larger society still doesn't quite know what to make of us. I don't know if that's going to last. But I do think that we can't just look inward. We can't just say our lesson from history is to defend ourselves and to build walls and to keep others out and to not care about other people. I hope our lesson is to take what we have learned and apply it to the rest of the world, to say this is what majorities do to minorities. We know about that. We're sensitive to that. We have empathy for you. We feel for you. Don't forget that the history of the Jews, the remarkable thing about the Jews is that this tiny people had this outsized effect, this little tribe from the Middle East, this sort of obscure corner of the Middle East. It was a little part of the Roman Empire at one point, and it's been part of other empires. Look at the influence that we've had. I mean, look at these stories were so powerful. This collection of stories, this Hebrew Bible, has so influenced the larger civilization. Really, I guess it's said that the two cornerstones of Western civilization are the Hebrew Bible and the Greco-Roman tradition. So I hope that we can continue to take the larger view of our place in the world and our influence in the world and our attitude toward other people, and not just turn inward and say, well, never again, and no one's going to push us around anymore. Okay, that's fine, that's important, but it's limiting. There has to be more.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's reflected in your title. Your title is an interesting one. Obviously you came up with a list, but then you sort of negate it with your not necessarily that order. So
right.
Is the title meant to sort of encapsulate the idea of larger thoughts, or how'd you come up with it?
Well, there is a book, a history of the Jews, called Jews, God, and History, written in, I want to say 1962, I think, by a guy named Max DeMont, and it was a big bestseller. It's still in print, as a matter of fact. I've read some of it. It was called Jews, God, and History, and it was on every middle-class Jewish bookshelf back during that time. I know we had a copy. I didn't read it then, but I imagine my father did. So I guess kind of took that word and that title and then wanted to mix it up and just say, well, this is the title. It's Jews, God. It's this big title, but maybe it's a little bit of a zing and a zets, and it's just a little different. It's not exactly what you're expecting. So I wanted to make it a little more fun. But it really is that those are really what it's about. It is about Jews, God, and history. But
Yeah.
at various times, the various each one of those three takes takes the spotlight.
Yeah. I mean, there's also like these recurring, I don't know if recurring is the right word, but there's these larger than life characters you sort of inhabit within the play. And that does seem to sort of like also have that sort of, they're larger than life, but they're still human in some way. So you do that, you make that balance between in that way as well.
Yeah, God appears in a couple of different two main, well, actually two or three guises. God, and very different personae, God himself. And then there are other. There's a as you recall, there's the longest scene in the show is a recreation of Yom Kippur at this Orthodox synagogue I went to, where there was this incredible charismatic rabbi, this remarkable guy, and I try to I hope do justice to his memory and to recreate what it was like to be in that room on Yom Kippur every year, to hear this man. He always davened. He was the rabbi. This is a big Orthodox shul, so they had other people to do the davening at various times. But he always davened Nila, the concluding service of Yom Kippur, and it was just an electric, remarkable experience to be in that room, to see this man lead this congregation. And Nila, it's a 20-30 minute service at the end of this long day of fasting, prayer, and repentance, this long, exhausting day in the synagogue. But to be there for him, it was such an electrifying experience. And so when you say larger than life, I mean, it's God, but there's also this rabbi who was definitely larger than life. And certainly in my memory, it gets even larger, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think of sort of, we're talking about theater or music or anything of that nature, the idea of the setup and then the payoff, right? Oftentimes the payoff is very short in time, but it's obviously the most heavy and sort of poignant part. So I think that like Nila is sort of, you've set yourself up for 24 hours and now you got one more, and then all of a sudden you hit that sort of sweet spot.
Yeah, and it's a very short thing. Like the clock's ticking down, you're hungry, you're starving, and then you look at the clock and you think, well, we have all these pages. Are we going to get them in 20 minutes? Of course, it's first the congregation reads the Shemona Esrei, the Amida themselves, and then it's time for the reader's repetition, and you keep getting closer. We're going to make it, or we're going to make it. But this guy, I guess most synagogues, they always find a way to time it out. This guy always did. It always ended after this incredible experience, but he always had it exactly at the right minute when it was time to blow the shofar and end the service. But yeah, it's always, and it's interesting. The service at the synagogue where we go to a conservative synagogue here on the Upper West Side, which is a very moving Nila service, but it's different. It's like the whole community is gathering in and is all making this grand expression together. In this case, it was, here's God on top, here's the rabbi, and then here's the congregation. And God was being channeled through the rabbi. Like God was in that room, but it was through this presence of this remarkable, charismatic man. Where we go now, it's more a communal effort, but here it was the community being led and being inspired by this man.
That's an interesting distinction. I remember growing up also, we had a cantor, wasn't the rabbi, but he also had his watch, next to him the entire time.
Yeah.
And he knew down to the second, do I have to go faster here? Do I have to go slower? How does it work? But also the idea of like, he's sort of the conduit. It's an interesting idea of conduit versus sort of disparate throughout the community.
Yeah.
And how different Jewish traditions might view that within their service.
Well, that's actually, I think that's one of the great things about our tradition, is that there are so many different ways of approaching it. There's one thing I say in the show, there's 16, every Jew has his or her own way of being Jewish, 16 million Jews in the world, 16 million different religions. And it's not literally exactly true because there are common elements, but there are so many different ways of interpreting Judaism and living with it and being part of the tradition. Another line, which, there are all the different rules. There's 613 rules in the Torah. And when you break it down, there's a lot more than that, because, well, we don't eat milk and meat. Well, okay, but then what? There's how long do you wait? There's how many sets of dishes. There had all these different things. and what constitutes milk, what constitutes meat, and all these different ways. So there's a lot more than 613 rules, but people choose, can you follow all the rules? Well, you'll drive yourself nuts, but you have to follow some of the rules. Otherwise, what makes you a Jew? So maybe you pick and choose the rules, but you got to find something there that you can follow to make you to say, okay, this applies to me. This is why and how I'm a Jew.
Yeah, I agree. There is, it's almost impossible to even know all the rules, let alone, and right, some of the rules apply to genders and how do we deal with, obviously in a more modern setting, what does that mean? And different things going on. It would be.
Yeah, it's wild. It's amazing. And everyone's got their own, and the old Jews, they don't do it right. That's it. That's all. That don't go there. They don't do it right. So everyone's got their own ideas of what constitutes doing it right.
And yet we do have, I think, even regardless of the strain of Judaism, I think everyone would agree that there is this idea of shul, temple, whatever you want to call it, and there is this idea of prayer, and we all have to get together and do it together. So there are these commonalities that do seem to come across.
And even people who don't go to the synagogue, they have other ways of being Jewish, whether it's their ethical outlook or just some sort of sensibility. So there are all sorts of elements of the tradition that I think can apply to people, and I hope people do take. I think it's important to take something from the tradition, because you don't want to. It's important to know who you are and to grow up grounded with some sense of who you are, where you come from. And I feel that strongly, even though I'm not particularly observant with regard to following all the rules, but I still feel that I still feel very much, even though I'm not a believing person, I'm not particularly observant, I feel that I'm still a member of the covenant, and it's still an inheritor of this tradition that dates back what, 4,000 years, when this wandering man on the plains of Mesopotamia heard a voice speaking to him. This man named Abraham heard this voice, and that's how it all began. And I feel like I'm, one inheritor of that tradition, and I'm very much take that from my father, and I didn't really know my grandfathers, but my father in particular, who was very much, for whom Judaism was a very important subject. And also my mother thought it was very different for her. For her, it was more cultural and less religious. But still, again, Judaism was so much a part of her character too, but it was a different interpretation. It was more Yiddish, less Hebrew, less belief in God than belief in just the general culture and sensibility, and the Yiddish culture from Eastern Europe.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing, the idea of Yiddish culture, and nowadays perhaps Israeli culture versus Judaism, and how do you define those things? Are they synonymous? Are they different? How do they differ? It's a very interesting idea.
Yeah.
Okay, and I don't want to take up more of your time. I know you're busy and it's your day off. You're still at the Flea Theater, right? For a little bit more.
Flea Theater for another 2 weeks, and people can go to JewsGodAndHistory.com and JewsGodAndHistory.com, and there'll be a link to buy tickets. We'll learn more about the show and about me, about the other people involved, about our director Brian Lane Green. And I should just say something about Brian Lane Green. Interesting guy. He comes from a line of Christian evangelical preachers. He's from Tennessee. He's a very successful actor as a young man, and now he's taken more to directing. But the show really spoke to him from the beginning, and he wanted to work on it, even though he's not of our tribe. But he's really, I can't thank him enough for how much, and can't give him enough credit for how much he's done. But and I hope that. So I hope it's not just Jews who will come see it. But anyway, I did want to mention Brian and note his background.